Thank you so much for having us today, and thank you to the IOP and Nieman Foundation for this opportunity. We're so excited to be here. I will be presenting the first half of this presentation, which for some of you may be Campaign Finance 101, and for some of you may be so much information that we just blow you away. So please, 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 always feel free to email Anna or myself or anyone at OpenSecrets, and we're always happy to help journalists covering this topic. So tracking money in politics is one of the most important things that you can do as a campaign journalist, but it's also one of the most challenging. From the technical challenges like, what am I looking at? How do I get the data I need? To interpretive ones like, is this normal? How does this fit into the broader context? To presentation ones like, how do I make my readers understand what I'm presenting? It's fraught with difficulty, but as Reince Priebus and Tom Perez both said last evening, understanding money in politics will make you smarter than most people talking about politics, so we are here today to help you be smarter. Today I'll walk through some of the key resources available, and I'm going to start with using the Federal Election Commission website, walk through some of the additional resources that we maintain at OpenSecrets, and Anna will close with how to find information about dark money. So at the federal level, we have a very well-established organization tasked with providing oversight and transparency over the campaign donations process. The Federal Election Commission, or FEC, also provides users access to campaign filings. They provide raw and processed data. They provide data downloads, which I would recommend looking into. And they have a great legal resource. So even if you're not a lawyer, I really recommend digging into that so that you can understand what's allowed and what's prohibited. So I use the FEC every day. One of the most important pages is actually one of the simplest. They're dates and deadlines, calendar. Every filer files on a different schedule. These schedules change. It depends, they can change depending on where in the primary you are, and it's just important to keep an eye on what to expect and when to expect it, particularly in an off year when you might want something much faster than the FEC is going to get it for you. So bookmark this page. With that resource established, I'm just going to walk through a basic filing. This is and I'm going to scroll up a little bit, the Nikki Haley for President Q1 filing from a few weeks ago. The FEC's made their search function quite nice now, so it's pretty easy to get to this page just using their search bar. But on this page, this is the basic information. You can tell that this is her active presidential campaign. You can find the campaign identifier, and you can see when she registered. You also can see the coverage period, the total amount of money she's raised, and from whom, how much she got from big donors, itemized donors, and how much she's received from unitemized donors, and I'll get a little bit more into that later. Every single political entity has to file something like this if they spend money in the kind of way that Anna will discuss in a little bit. So you can get this for any political committee, and it all has the same information. They take slightly different forms, but the top line numbers will always be the same. You can see here the transfers from other committees. That's money coming in through the joint fundraising committee that she set up to support her campaign and the party. I'll get into that a little bit later as well. And then you can see at the bottom of this kind of landing page, if I can scroll to it, the amount she has spent. So lots of information just on the landing page. If you want to dive deeper into her filing, it's not challenging to do. It's not letting me. Sorry. Is it supposed to? It seems frozen. Is it not connected anymore? Oh, there we go, okay. You can click on her, there we go, got it. Her filing page, and then you can get directly to her personal financial, or to her quarterly filing. You click on this April quarterly, it'll take you to the PDF where you can read every single contribution made. Further over, even before you can access the PDF, the FEC will make the raw data available quite quickly. This is really, really helpful on sort of day of filing deadline reporting, which is a lot of what I get questions about. So I would definitely recommend checking this out. Sometimes you can get really good information, like this is just the first page of her donations, the money coming from any person who made a donation in that period. Sort of right off the bat on this page, you can see these 3 donations at the top from Jessica Aaron, giving $6,600, which is the amount that you can give to a candidate in an election cycle. And then right after, a $3,300 refund and another $3,300 donation. Very confusing when you look at it like this, but if you actually go to the page itself, that information becomes a lot more clear. What she's doing is taking that $6,600, which is far too big for a single donation, and splitting it into her primary and general campaign. So you'll see that a lot, particularly early in a cycle when people are trying to get in at the ground level. So always check the, this is the primary source. And the FEC allows you to link to this pretty easily, and I think it's a very good resource. As I mentioned, there was information on that landing page about the Joint Fundraising Committee information, and that's become quite important over time. Donald Trump's campaign used joint fundraising committees almost more than he used his campaign committee. And essentially how that works is the Joint Fundraising Committee takes money for the candidate and affiliated organizations, be it the National Party or other sort of allied candidates, and then distributes that. So on Haley's, her line 18s, as I'd call them, you can see the amount coming in from the Joint Fundraising Committee at the top of this page, and then you can see all of the additional information who made money through the Joint Fundraising Committee. This is important because if you only look at the money from people on the line 17s, which is what most people have been sort of taught to look for, you miss, in this case, $1.8 million of individual donations. So if you're looking for money from a person, you have to check both places. Note too that not on this page, but on similar pages, you'll see information from groups like WinRed or ActBlue. Now, people tend to get very up in arms about WinRed and ActBlue and think that there's something big and nefarious about them, but they tend to just be like the Apple Pay or Stripe for the political parties. So you'll see them, because they operate in federal politics, they file massive reports with every single $2 donation that they process. And what a donor is doing is they're giving to Haley or Trump or whoever uses the platform, which is most candidates now, but they're actually giving to ActBlue or WinRed, who is then distributing the money directly and immediately to the candidate. So you see that transaction reported 3 times, both going into ActBlue and out of ActBlue and going into the candidate campaign. So you have to be really careful to not triple count those donations, and I have seen that happen in reporting, so always watch out. So, just to keep in mind that that will be in the data that you look at. So for somebody who doesn't work for the FEC, I've spent a lot of time on the FEC site so far, but I work for OpenSecrets. And the reason you would use OpenSecrets instead of the FEC is because we provide a lot more information on context, on history. We also do some cleaning of the data. We assign industry classifications so that you can know what a group is. We identify groups as dark money or partially disclosing. So we do that kind of value add, and we maintain all of this data back in time. The FEC is by far the best resource for day of sort of on the campaign trail reporting for a specific candidate. But I'd like to call out one section in particular because we don't have 2024 data yet. And that's our election overview section. We do have 2024 data behind the scenes, and again, always feel free to email me or Anna. And we can get that for you. But the election overview section is one of my favorite and most used sections of our website. And here you can find all information about candidates over time, contextualized. So if you heard, for example, that Rep. Ocasio-Cortez was raising 70% of her money from small donors, what is that? Like, what does that mean? Is that a lot? It sounds like a lot. Is it average? Where does it fit in terms of overall candidates fundraising? We track that information and maintain it, and you can see that among members of Congress now, she actually is 3rd, with 67% of her money coming from small donors. So before you go making a big story about how little someone's getting from small donors or how much, it's important to place that candidate in the context of other candidates like them. And we have developed resources to make that easy. One question that somebody in this room asked in advance of the panel was, how do you know whether a candidate has raised enough money to be viable? Is there a monetary threshold that somebody needs to meet in order to be considered a contender? And the short answer is that the majority of candidates are not contenders and will never be. I'm sorry to them, because the re-election rates in Congress are just so high. We have that information on OpenSecrets as well. Actually, in the last election cycle in 2022, every single senator who ran for re-election was re-elected. And that hasn't happened since, I believe, 1916. So, short answer, it's hard to be a contender. And so there is no real monetary threshold. But if I were to try to use OpenSecrets to answer that question, I would dig into this section. And we will show that in 2022, the average House winner spent about $2.7 million. But that includes people like incumbents, safe incumbents running for re-election. So what about candidates who might need a little bit more money to win? What do they look like? I would navigate over to our incumbency advantage section, if I could, or it's going to glitch again. And I would see, because I know what's on this page, that if you scroll all the way down, that in 2022 in the House, a candidate who defeated an incumbent spent $2.9 billion. So slightly over that 2.7 that the average member spent. But that, in and of itself, is a bit of a historical anomaly. It's lower than we have seen in the past, where in the past you've seen that an incumbent, to take down an incumbent in the House, you need to spend more like $4 million, quite a bit more than the average spent by a candidate. So is $4 million the answer to that question in terms of spending? I don't think so, because unless you consider the outside spending, Reince Priebus talked about this yesterday, the soft money, you're missing, in many races, the vast majority of the spending that's going on. For example, this page, outside spending, this is super PAC spending, party committee spending by race. You can see in Michigan, there was $26 million spent in the 7th congressional district there. This is House races. If I were to select Senate races or others, you'd see hundreds of millions of dollars. So for every single race you cover, every single time, you want to check the outside spending too, or you're missing potentially millions of dollars. I always do this. I run out of time, and then I spend 5 seconds talking about our amazing state data. Another opportunity for you to email me. We maintain followthemoney.org, which is the same resource, but for state-level data. And when you start to talk about state-level data, you start to talk about 50 different disclosure regimens. And the FEC, for its flaws, is a great data portal. The equivalent FEC for North Dakota is not a great data portal, but we collect the paper filings made by candidates in states like North Dakota or Mississippi and hand enter that data into the Follow the Money database. It's the only resource like this in the country. And by using our Ask Anything tool, you can pull up current contribution data to all state legislative, gubernatorial, statewide office holders. It's a little tricky to use, but again, that's why you call me. In this case, I pulled up the donations to all active 2022 Secretary of State candidates. As we know, Secretaries of State, Attorneys General, they are writing our future, and people do not follow that money. So if you cover state and local data, primarily state, you should check out Follow the Money, and you'll get a much clearer picture of who's trying to influence our politics. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anna.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Let's see. Neither do I. Is this the clicker? All right. There we go. So I'm here to talk about dark money. I'm going to go very quickly since there's a lot to go over, but just to go back to the basics, dark money is any type of spending or giving that comes from undisclosed sources to influence political outcomes. This can take a wide variety of different appearances and go through a number of different groups, but one of the most commons are 501c4 nonprofits, which we'll get to in the next page. Overall, we have seen more than $2 billion in dark money since the Supreme Court Citizens United decision in 2010. This was really the decision that opened the floodgates to a lot of types of outside spending, along with us and a few other cases, and we've really been tracking the increase in dark money since then. So going into the types of dark money, 501c4 nonprofits are one of the primary ways that secret donors may try to funnel money into US politics. While 501c4s are not necessarily supposed to be political vehicles, there are very few rules and regulations that really stop them from spending millions of dollars on politics. One of the main things is that politics cannot be their primary purpose. Their primary purpose is supposed to be social welfare, but that is something that is not necessarily very well enforced, and there are a number of different ways that groups can skirt the law to really spend almost their entire revenue on dark money. So this is darkmoney.org. This is an OpenSecrets page that we maintain with a lot of the basics, going into a little bit more detail there. In addition to the 501c4s I mentioned, you also have things like LLCs that could be shell companies. Many states don't require any person to be listed on the corporate records for shell companies, and so that's something that presents a number of problems with disclosure when it comes to FEC records or campaign finance records generally. Every year, I believe over at least the last 3 years, we've seen an increase in the number of LLCs giving money to groups like super PACs that Sarah mentioned. And so that's something that we've been looking into as well. You can find all of the details about what dark money is, how to track it, all of that here. Going into some of OpenSecrets resources, here's outside spending by disclosure. Sarah mentioned this page earlier. In addition to just the spending and the group names and the group types, we also have disclosure level. And so you're going to see a lot of groups with a half filled in circle there. That means these groups are partially disclosing or gray money. That means that they may have taken money from a dark money group or 501c4 or in some way not fully disclosed their donors. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more later, but that's something that's really increasing. On the right, you see all of the dark money spenders, and these are primarily dark money groups, but also super PACs that are fully funded by dark money. But that is only the groups that are disclosing to the FEC. And there are many other groups that, through a variety of means, don't disclose their spending at all. One of the ways is through avoiding the magic words. This is words like vote for, elect, defeat, that could trigger disclosure rules if you're spending within the either 30 or 60 days before an election, depending on the type of election, and if you're spending through traditional means. And so as long as you avoid those words, you can say, my senator is great, this senator is terrible, and do it very close to an election with very few repercussions if you're not filing anything. And of course, no donor disclosure. Going into some of the changes, the partially disclosing groups I mentioned earlier, you can see that real increase in recent years, and dark money really kind of fluctuating and starting to go down. But that doesn't mean dark money is decreasing. In fact, we tracked over $1 billion in dark money during the 2020 cycle, but only about 88 million of that, not exactly a small amount, but in the grand scheme of a multi-billion-dollar election, a pretty small amount, was FEC reported spending. The vast majority of that was ads, like issue ads that avoid those magic words and are therefore not required to be disclosed to the FEC. A large part of that was also online advertising, which have even more disclosure loopholes because you are able to use those magic words not just up to the 30 or 60 day period that usually triggers a disclosure window with the FEC, but up to election day. And that's something that started to change more recently, but during that election cycle, we tracked significant amounts of online ad spending. One of the challenges to that you may encounter is that while many platforms post online advertising, they don't all disclose their advertising. So they may not, unlike Facebook or Google or Snapchat, where they do have a database showing who's spending, how much, who they're targeting, many other platforms do not. And so this is a very conservative estimate that's likely to undercount, and the other ones continue to be in the dark. Going over very quickly, because I know we're nearing time for questions, here's the difference between the FEC reported spending, which you can see on the left is about, I believe, 14 million, and the total dark money spending, including those ads and contributions to super PACs on the right, which is over 125 million just for that top group. And so there's a substantial amount of dark money that we're really not encompassing if you're just looking at FEC data. Here you can see it in a different format where you see the rise in dark money contributions and kind of the fluctuation and decrease in dark money being reported to the FEC. More often now we're seeing dark money groups giving money to super PACs that then will spend on elections. And so that's something that's a little bit more challenging to tackle and oftentimes requires looking at contribution data instead of just spending data. And here's another way of how we get a more complete picture of dark money groups. Oftentimes, again, not just relying on the FEC, we also look at things like state-level campaign finances, online advertising. We also pull in Labor Department filings in some circumstances, lobbying disclosure filings. There's so many different places that we really need to check. And even then, it's still not a comprehensive picture of dark money groups. There's still so much else out there that we might not be able to find. But this is at least the places that we would check if we were looking into a shell company or a dark money group. IRS records are really the meat of that. One of the places I would look first, especially if it's a 501c4 that's registered as a tax-exempt group. While they don't disclose their spending or their funders to the FEC, they do at least disclose their revenue, their funding, and not their funders, but their funding, their spending, and a variety of other details such as board members, foreign investments, and outgoing grants in their annual Form 990. But you don't get this until 5.5 months after an election cycle, or after their fiscal year is over, which makes the information not always fresh and interesting, and oftentimes will make online ad advertising data much more congestible at the time that it's actually useful to voters, because you're getting that information from the tax returns sometimes after an election is over. This is an example of how we use the FCC political ad data to track where a dark money in combination with FEC data to track where a dark money group gave money to a super PAC the same day the super PAC spent money on ads. That's pretty common. But these groups were affiliated, and that's something that we're seeing increasingly as well, is not just dark money groups giving to random super PACs, but in many cases super PACs that could be run by the same people out of the same group. In this case, the groups were Tennesseans for a Better Tomorrow and Tomorrow for a Better Tennessee, which are not exactly hiding the fact that they're related. And then both groups shut down right after the election. So they effectively were able to funnel money into influencing elections and then shut down with no repercussions. I'm going to skip over digital ad data, go into corporate disclosures very quickly since I mentioned the ads earlier. This is another way that we look for at least information when companies are the givers. So some companies have voluntary corporate disclosures and will report the nonprofits that they give to, but only about half of the S&P 500 companies actually do this. And that is everything. I think we need to go to questions. If you could please line up at the microphones in the room, we will alternate from one microphone to another. And if you could just introduce yourself with your full name and the organization.
Hi, I'm Joseph Bustos. I'm a reporter with the state newspaper in Columbia, South Carolina. You mentioned Nikki Haley at the top, and there is some confusion over her numbers when she promoted them and what actually got filed. So the two-part questions: what's the best way to count donations, add up donations, and how many joint fundraising committees can people have, and what's the best way to track who's with who?
Great question. So oftentimes candidates will share their data before they have to file with the FEC. That is not primary source. And I have seen many times where candidates will give you the sunny picture and then they file 2 weeks later and they have misstated or misattributed information or just overstated, kind of not quite misinformation, but definitely disinformation. And so I would always be hesitant when reporting on anything that the candidate gives you themselves. They're doing that to maintain a strategic advantage over their opponents. They're not going to share anything with you that they don't think is in their interest. So in the Haley case, what she probably did was add up the money from the transfers and the individual donations, and so it inflates it accurately, in my opinion, but it certainly won't match what's on her form. As for joint fundraising committees, you can have, to my belief, as many as you want. And the only way they don't have to necessarily file information about who's with who and all of that. Although the joint fundraising committee's disclosure form when they first register should have that information on it. You have to look at their spending. On every joint fundraising committee filing, because they too have to file, they will have all the money going out of the JFC, and you can see to whom that money is being given. But that includes, I mean, there's state candidates, they don't have to file with the FEC. I mean, they could be giving to anyone, and so it can be a bit of a game of spaghetti. I'd say most often a candidate will be getting support from one JFC, but I think Trump has like 5, so it varies depending on the candidate. Did that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Megan Horsted, and I'm a reporter with the Daily Chronicle located in DeKalb, Illinois. My question is, we are seeing dark money entering local school board elections, such as the one in Oswego. What tips do you have for tracking and reporting on this so it's useful to voters as they head to the polls?
That's a great question. So one of the ways that I would, at least if you're just starting to look into a group, one of the places I would look would be corporate records. OpenSecrets is a really great resource unrelated to OpenSecrets where you can search corporate records across the country. I wouldn't be, so in some cases, even if a group is spending in your state, they may not be incorporated in that state. Many of them may incorporate in Delaware or Wyoming or some other states that have less stringent disclosure rules. And so I would recommend searching through OpenSecrets to see across the country where they're incorporated, look at those incorporation records, if they're available, bylaws. In some states, they don't require any person to be listed, so they're less useful, but if you request the records in some states, you can at least see who the lawyer is. That can provide additional information, and in some cases, who is actually incorporating the group. I would also recommend IRS tax records instead of the Form 990, which won't be filed until after their fiscal year is over. If they do have tax exempt status already, I would recommend the Form 1024, which is their tax exempt application materials. This is something that, like both this and the 990, you can request either directly from the group or from the IRS. The IRS has a form you can fill out and email, and they will get it back to you. Sometimes the IRS wait times are long, so I would recommend at least trying with the group, since if they have normal business hours, you can show up to their office and they have to give the document same day, or if you have a written request to them, and sometimes they can actually ask you to send them a letter. If you have a written request, it's 30-day limit, and so they're legally required to give you those documents. I would also recommend looking at online advertising, looking at Facebook data, Google data, Snapchat data, and all the other sources that are out there. Because in some cases you do have contact information in there as well. You can look at the content of the ads. You can also see targeting information, which is something that many of the companies have only recently started integrating, which I think can be very useful in those cases.
Thank you.
I was going to add too, we have a tip sheet assembled that I think was distributed or should be distributed to this group that has a lot of those links. And then with the online ads, we didn't get a chance to show this, but Facebook, this is all self-regulated, by the way. Facebook recently rolled out a feature that allows you to look for similar groups. So if you see that the Illinois Policy Institute, for example, is spending in a state school board race here, and you click on their Facebook transparency portal and look for that group, it will allow you to see similar groups, which oftentimes are shells or pink slime groups or other sort of dark money groups that might not be on the disclosure sort of on the advertisement itself. So I'd definitely check that out.
Hi, my name is Haley B. Miller. I cover Ohio politics for the USA Today network. You mentioned that you're seeing LLCs more, and I'm kind of dealing with that for the first time. Can you talk about where they fall in all this, what's kind of allowed and not allowed legally?
Yes, so we have seen with every election cycle more LLCs. At OpenSecrets, we also do manual review of potential shell companies, which is how we get those disclosure levels that I noted on our outside spending page. In some cases, LLCs are just a black box where you really can't find much information, and it really depends on what state they're incorporated in. Even in Delaware, you can request from the Delaware government office their incorporation records in Delaware, which can sometimes have names on them. But oftentimes, if a group is trying to hide its spending or hide information, there's a number of ways it can do that. They can just hire, I think it's like the incorporation company or something that you can incorporate for you so that their company is listed on the documents instead of your name. And so there's a lot of ways around that. The main role that we're releasing LLCs take at this point is as a giver, so contributions to super PACs, contributions to mostly super PACs and I guess hybrid PACs to some extent, and state level committees as well. There is some level of of spending that we've seen in online advertising by corporations and other almost non-entities, which is about as opaque as you can get, where a group may have no incorporation records, no actual tax-exempt status, but are spending pretty significant sums on online advertising. And that's something else that we've seen with this role of, in some cases, smaller corporations doing that. And it becomes very difficult to track. Online ad resources are great. The incorporation records I mentioned are great as well, at least as a supplement to the campaign finance disclosures. But in some cases, there just isn't much information out there. If you do get addresses, another thing that I usually check is property records. Those could be useful to see a surprising number of consultants incorporate their dark money groups out of their house and a few out of their parents' houses. And it's a great way to at least track that down.
You started to answer a little bit of this. I'm Amanda Becker with the 19th in terms of LLCs and their houses. So when I look at FEC filings and at OpenSecrets, which I use all the time, so thank you for providing that to all of us, there's an entire class of people in this country that are getting extremely rich, and it's really hard to track, and rich off of political donations and political money. And so I'll often see like one 501c4, let's say, that then gives a disbursement to another dark money group, and then that dark money group pays huge vendor fees, for example, to a firm owned by somebody at the original group, and then you lose the paper trail. Is there any, and you don't know what happens to that money after that, is there any way to track disbursements and expenditures between committees and between entities more closely?
Yes, I would recommend looking at the Form 990 tax records. So they're required to disclose their top 5 vendors that are over $100,000, as well as any payments to board members or key employees that are paid, I believe it's over $100,000. And so that way you can at least see who the vendors are. Cross-checking their addresses with other groups can be helpful. And also in the Form 990, you can actually see their outgoing grants. This isn't exactly timely. You're getting this 5.5 months after their fiscal year is over, but you can see those grants between groups and really try to track that. What you're describing is not uncommon for these groups to have networks, oftentimes run by the same people, this whole kind of a network of different groups, and that is one of the ways that they can skirt the limits on political activity for these groups, or at least give the appearance of doing so. So for example, the rule of thumb with the IRS is no more than or under half of your activities can be political if you're a 501c4 social welfare group, but they could describe their spending as educational. They could say we're giving grants, and that offsets the actual political spending that they're doing. And so it becomes almost a numbers game, and by giving it to that group and then them paying it back, you're watering down their overall spending in a way that doesn't make it look like they're just doing politics. And so I would say the Form 990s are probably the best route for that. I would also recommend state charitable registries. Some states have really great registries where you will actually be able to get the tax form instead of having to request it from the group itself or from the IRS. And I know North Carolina and Florida are really great. There's a number of other states that also make it very easy to search, and even in some cases have other records other than the Form 990s that go into more depth.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Julie O'Donohue. I work for a nonprofit news outlet called Louisiana Illuminator, which is in Louisiana. My question is a little bit less technical. I guess I'd be curious how you all think news outlets should be reporting on campaign finance stuff. I think a lot of news outlets, when the deadline hits, they do a straight story about how much each candidate has raised. Sometimes that includes outside money, sometimes it doesn't. And I guess increasingly with all the dark money and coming into campaigns, and I wonder how useful you think that is, or what type of reporting you think that news outlets should or should not be doing. I hope my question's understandable.
Do you want me to take it or you?
And maybe we both can jump in on this one. I mean, what should you be doing? That is a very deep question, because I think that you're right. Filing deadline hits, flurry of stories about total raised, total spent, et cetera. And what that's trying to do is to establish that kind of viability question. Like, is somebody falling behind? It becomes almost a money horse race story, which maybe isn't that interesting when you see it 50 different times by 50 different state reporters. But I think that when you mention the dark money groups and sort of all of that, that is a much more interesting story to me. To be able, I saw, actually, I'll say call it a specific reporting outlet at ProPublica put out a fantastic resource about the school board race spending question in Illinois, actually, which is where I live. And they did in-depth research as to every single nonprofit, charitable organization, LLC, everything that spent money in Illinois school races. And that is that's the information that you need to know as a consumer of news. That's in-depth reporting. You have to establish the entire ecosystem of political activity in that area. It's hard. But when I saw that, I read it, and I work in this space, so I see a lot of reporting on campaign finance, and that was just very exciting to me. To see that level of detail by a state and local reporter. So I think that that's kind of my answer. Additionally, if you work for a regionally focused paper, you know actors, you know people in that space that we definitely do not know. And so being able to tell the story about your community and the people in your community who are being affected by, in many cases, outside, not just outside the disclosure regime, but outside of your state, I think is a noble enterprise that I think I'd like to see more people doing.
And I second everything Sarah just said, but I think the biggest thing if I was trying to tell someone what to do would be to get the terms correct and actually ask questions. It sounds like a small thing, but you'll oftentimes see the dark money super PACs and no distinction, honestly, between soft and hard money. And so I think getting those terms and making sure you're using the terms correctly can really add legitimacy to reporting and make it something that other people can rely on and know what they're talking about. And so I think that's the biggest thing, and also asking questions, bringing in experts, really making all that information a part of it, rather than just saying, okay, I get the numbers, this is easy, because they're not always what they seem. And so making sure you're actually getting it right, I think, is really important.
And I think we have time for maybe one more question, but if there aren't any, we'll give people a chance to line up. I definitely would like to thank IOP and Nieman again for having us here today. And OpenSecrets is a public resource. We don't charge for the service that we provide. We ourselves are a 501c3. So please reach out to us at any point. We would be happy to help, and happy to help provide data that we might have in our data resources that are not publicly on the website yet. So I hope to hear from many of you in the next few weeks. And thanks again for having us.